Here we are at last, the weird one out, the strange hot take, the case for the Ukrainian Hornets. I won't say this is the last video in this series, but it's definitely the one I've found most interesting while doing my research. Now, I do have to point out that this isn't a concept I came up with. This is actually something I heard on a live stream that Ward Carroll had done with Justin Bronk of Military Aviation History. Someone in the live chat had asked Justin Bronk for his thoughts on sending Legacy Hornets to Ukraine for them to use like the Finnish Air Force does. He thought that, while it was possible, it wouldn't be as good for improvised runways or short takeoff and landing as the Gripen, and isn't as plentiful and readily available as the F-16. Well, I don't disagree with that assessment because it is true. I do think that being a jack of all trades, or maybe not succeeding into the same degree that the Gripen and the F-16 doesn't mean it's a bad option and might be the best available option, because being a jack of all trades and a master of none might actually be better for Ukraine's situation currently. That's why I want to make this video. The Hornet is underrepresented in conversations that are otherwise dominated by F-16 or Gripen. Sure, it's not as prolific as the F-16 and wasn't designed from the ground up to operate off of roadways like the Gripen. However, it does fix the problems that plague both those platforms. While the Legacy Hornets aren't as plentiful as the F-16, they still have a decent number of units either in storage, or being mothballed, or being phased out of service. And while the Hornet isn't technically classified as a STOL or short takeoff and landing aircraft, like the Gripen is, it can land on improvised runways that are at least 2 kilometers long and are mostly straight and flat. Not only is the Hornet able to match these plans, or the aspects that the Gripen and the F-16 have that's the biggest pro, maybe not one-to-one, but very closely, it does provide a more structured move into the future as well. So the Hornets right now can effectively kind of do the good that the Gripen or the F-16 would, but provide a better option in the future, and we'll take a look at that in more detail in a moment. But that is why I'm here, and this is what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about, well, the first thing I've got to talk about, obviously, is the recap of the Legacy Hornets and the Super Hornet. Looking over their hard stats, the video game numbers, trading card numbers, whatever you want to call it. Then we'll look at the differences in the platforms, the pros and cons of both, the timing, and a proposal on how it could work in stages. We'll take a look at the different tactical aviation brigades and how the Hornets would work within the existing mission profiles. We'll cover the politics and logistics of both, and then I'll take a look at the credits, and I will talk to you about the future videos that I'm currently working on after this one. As for the Legacy Hornet, we have an empty weight of about 23,000 pounds, just under that of the Mig-29 and Su-27. For total weight, it goes up to just under 52,000 pounds fully loaded. Its max speed tops out at Mach 1.7, a little bit slower than the Viper, the Gripen, the Fulcrum, and the Flanker, but it's still pretty fast. I've seen some figures suggest that it can hit Mach 1.8, maybe slightly faster, but most of the time what I've seen consistently is Mach 1.7. I've debated on removing combat radius, as I've seen some pretty big variations jumping from like 330 miles to over 1,000. Of course, this varies greatly depending on the weight, altitude, and speed of the aircraft, so I'll leave it there, but just know that it's a much wider range, and that's not necessarily the specific end-all be-all number for this. Its service ceiling comes in at 50,000 feet, making it capable of handling air superiority and interception missions. Probably the most important number to remember for the Legacy Hornet, though, is its 8,000-hour service life, as most of the airframes that we would be looking at with the Legacy Hornets are coming up on that or have well blown past it. Several different countries have extended the service life of their Legacy Hornets, and while they do fly, they are more prone to technical issues. According to the Department of Defense's comptroller in the fiscal year 2019, a Legacy Hornet had an operating cost of just under $20,000 an hour. Pretty high by comparison, but the Legacy Hornet production lines don't exist anymore, so that kind of just comes with the territory. Plus, that's just a baseline figure with a lot of varying degrees of everything else added on top of it, so take that as the baseline, and then all of the consumable or salary-based costs on top of that will vary per country. Its wing loading comes in at 93 pounds per square inch, being a little bit higher than that of the Mig-29 and Su-27. This can be a sign of worse performance, however, it doesn't tell the whole story. There's not one particular number for an aircraft that tells you whether it's good or not. Its thrust-to-weight ratio comes in at 0.96, only lower than that of the Mig-29 and Su-27 in some instances again. As for its radar, most units are equipped with the APG-73 pulse Doppler radar with an effective range of 70 miles. The capacity to upgrade to the APG-79 AESA radar does exist, but to my knowledge, no countries have actually done this, so I'm not sure that any actually exist in that configuration at the moment. Lastly, we have it being powered by two GEF 404 GE 402 turbofan engines, kicking out about 17,700 pounds of static thrust. I do believe that is with the afterburner engaged, producing more thrust by comparison to the Su-24, 25, Mig-29, and Su-27s. As for the Super Hornet, we have a pretty big jump in its empty weight to just over 32,000 pounds, moving the max takeoff weight up to 66,000 pounds. This extra weight and two additional weapon station means the Super Hornet can carry more munitions or fuel if it needs to. The max speed stays just about the same, maybe varying 0.1 Mach between the two, up to Mach 1.8. Combat radius also varies wildly here, as I've seen as small as 449 miles up to over 1,400 miles. So once again, not a purely indicative number, but gives you kind of like an average, kind of the low end in this instance. Service ceiling stays at 50,000 feet, but the service life gets to vary a little bit depending on which block, between 6,000 to 10,000 hours, and its cost per flight hour comes down to just over $12K. Once again, thanks to the DoD and its comptroller, at least the data pulled from fiscal year 2019. Wing loading and thrust-to-weight ratio are pretty much the same. Most Super Hornets are rocking the APG-79 AESA radar, though, giving them a range of about 90 miles. Lastly, we have two GE F414 GE 400 turbofan engines producing 222,000 pounds of static thrust, once again, in afterburner. So what are the differences? Now, aside from the hard facts, what else are we looking at? We saw the weight, we saw the engines, what else is going on here? Well, probably the most notable visual difference is going to be the size and the silhouette. The Super Hornet is about 25% larger in terms of its wings and has a fairly largely extended and expanded leading edge, and the intakes have been enlarged as well. This is usually, visually speaking, how you'll be able to tell an F-18. Now, visually speaking, an F-18 Super Hornet Block 1 and 2 look roughly the same, with the Block 3, in some instances, having the conformal fuel tanks to look a little different. But generally speaking, they're all roughly the same looking. Not only does the size difference help in terms of its carrying capacity for munitions and fuel, but also oddly enough helps lessen the radar cross-section of the jet. Now, a lot of the changes to the Super Hornet were done specifically for this reason, largely the enlarged intakes and the leading edge being slightly less curved and a little bit sharper, but generally speaking, it's still not going to be a stealth aircraft. While the size difference is pretty notable, the Hornets have about 90% of the same avionics systems, save for the cockpit, depending on, once again, which variant of the Super Hornet you're looking at. And the Super Hornet overall uses 42% fewer parts than that of the Legacy Hornet, so it's been simplified, but also made larger. Along with the size and competition, the upgraded F414 engines help compensate for the larger frame of the Super Hornet, keeping most of the same performance characteristics. So largely it is bigger, but it's more powerful and effectively operates similarly to that of the Legacy Hornet. Not only can the Super Hornet, though, carry more fuel right off the bat, it also has two more weapon stations that you can add weapons to, so you can have effectively the same full loadout that a Hornet would have, plus the two additional fuel tanks. Alongside the additional weapon stations, you also have the Growler configuration and its jamming equipment, which is a mainstay in the U.S. Navy. In terms of the pros of the Legacy Hornet, though, we have to start with its use by the Finnish and Swiss Air Forces. Operating in a similar manner to Sweden and its Gripen, these two countries have experience with improvised roadway or improvised runway drills for their fleet of Legacy Hornets. Both operate a fairly decent-sized fleet, with Switzerland operating 25 and the Finns operating about 55. While I doubt the Swiss would be much help in this particular instance, it is possible that the Finns might be able to assist in the training of Ukrainian pilots on this type of operation. It's important that the Hornet can do just pretty much everything the Gripen can do, just in a longer manner. So it needs about 2 kilometers of straight flat roadways, and luckily for the Legacy Hornets, that is something central Ukraine has in droves. I will note that central Ukraine is largely wide open plain country, so while it does have a lot of long, straight, unimpeded roads, it also doesn't have a lot of tree cover, so hiding these aircraft might be a little more difficult, but they could absolutely operate off of those roads. While it is kind of a minor thing to talk about, the general design of the Legacy Hornet is actually a little bit more similar to that of the Mig-29 and Su-27 airframes versus the F-16 or the Gripen, with its leading edge extension and its body generating lift, much like the Mig-29 and Su-27. This doesn't necessarily work to the exact same extent, as those two have larger bodies that generate lift for the short takeoff and landing capability to an extent, mostly for the Mig-29. But you do have a similar capability, just slightly less effective in that of the Legacy Hornet as well. Sure, the kinematic nature of these aircraft isn't going to be one-to-one, but the Legacy Hornet does have good low-speed performance and high angle of attack maneuver ability, which is something that the Fulcrum and Flanker pilots can absolutely use, as that's something they use in both of their aircraft that Gripen pilots and Viper pilots wouldn't have a similar situation for. It's true the Hornets aren't as fast or maneuverable as the existing Flankers or Fulcrums, but it does make up with it with more modern systems, longer range missiles that we'll take a look at in a moment, and generally more capability that every other mission the Ukrainians need, they don't have. Not only can it operate off of improvised roadways, but it might be a little bit easier for pilots to transition to as well. Sure, it's not, like I said, one-to-one to the Mig-29 and Su-27, but in terms of their maneuvers, they would have similar capability with that of the Hornet, and they would have a little bit more similar kinematic experience than that of the Gripen or the F-16. I'll go into more details later, but there are several countries that are working to transition their Legacy Hornet fleets out of service in the coming years, so these may be the airframes that Ukraine could use in the future. Probably the starkest contrast, though, between the Ukrainian inventory and the Legacy Hornet is its top speed. Mach 1.7 isn't exactly slow, but by comparison to the Fulcrum or Flanker, pilots are absolutely going to notice. While most pilots aren't constantly zooming around at Mach 2, having that capability is pretty important. There's also a fairly large acceleration difference with the Legacy Hornet, and by extension the Super Hornet, being slower in terms of its acceleration than that of the Fulcrum and Flanker. That will possibly be a pretty big difference that the Ukrainians may not be okay with. It is something that maybe with the arsenals they'll use less, and like I said, they're not flying around at Mach 2 all day, but having that capability and having that acceleration is pretty important if you do get into a dogfight. Now, the Hornet can counter this, but it is still nonetheless a bit of a problem. The Legacy Hornets are also older airframes. Well, similar to the age of the Ukrainian inventory currently, the Hornets will most likely require more maintenance that the Ukrainian maintenance corps won't be as well versed in. This is something that the United States Marine Corps is currently dealing with. There's an excellent interview over on the Drive with an anonymous United States Marine Corps maintainer going into the struggles to keep enough airframes in the sky for their pilots to get to their necessary hours. To be fair, though, they do also say in the interview that the Prowler and Harrier were much worse in terms of maintenance by comparison to that of the Legacy Hornet. If naval aviation comes second to the Air Force, the United States Marine Corps unfortunately comes third from the DoD's perspective. They are still an important air wing, but not the highest in terms of its overall priority, unfortunately. This also leads me to believe that most of the stored United States Marine Corps Legacy Hornets have been probably picked over for parts, so they may not be in flyable states at the moment. I'll expound on this later, but these airframes aren't meant to last Ukraine for 10 to 20 years. They just need to get them a few years. However, knowing these mechanical problems will pop up is pretty important, especially if that's something you're trying to sell the Ukrainians on. It is something, though, that all things equal, the F-16 is probably going to have equal, if not more problems, not necessarily due to the age of the airframe, but just due to the complexity of the F-16, whereas the Gripen's probably the best in this situation, but once again, you can't get Gripen, so just kind of how it is. So technically, the Legacy Hornet isn't ESTIL either, but the Finn's improvised roadway drills only require about 2 kilometers of roadway to be shut down, so most likely less is actually used for the landings, but they needed that extra space for safety. This was one of the main concerns that Justin Bronk voiced about the Hornet, and while I'm no professional and definitely not as knowledgeable in this field as Mr. Justin Bronk, I do think that might be a bit more, I don't want to say overblown, but maybe more of a concern than it needs to be. Geographically speaking, a large swath of Ukraine's roadways will work, as well as a lot of their smaller regional airports. This adds a lot of variety to the Ukrainian mix in terms of where they can land, where they can operate from versus F-16, and while Gripen might do it better, once again, you can't get Gripen, at least anytime soon. While the Legacy Hornet does exist in fairly reasonable numbers, it's nowhere as prolific as the F-16, though. Due to this, there's no real widespread infrastructure in Europe to support Legacy Hornets, save that of Finland, Spain, and Switzerland. None of these countries are close to Ukraine's border. The closest is probably Finland, but they also have to cross the Baltic Sea, and then they go through several other countries. So maybe for large industrial stuff, that might not be too bad, but it is still something. Crossing water and then going to roadways isn't necessarily the easiest way. It might make things a little easier. It's hard to say. The Baltic's an interesting place. But next you'd probably have Switzerland, and with their neutrality, they're probably not going to do too much business in terms of providing wartime equipment or parts or maintenance. But we do have Spain, which is technically on the other side of the European continent, but is a place that has Legacy Hornets, that maintains their Hornets, and probably has some of the industrial base to keep a pack of Hornets in the air. Now for the Super Hornet. Just like its predecessor, the Super Hornet's extended leading edge and larger wings give it better low-speed performance. This also keeps the Super Hornet somewhat kinematically similar to that of the Fulcrum and Flanker. Once again, it's not one-to-one, but it's more so than that of the Gripen or the Viper. There are a lot of future options here as well, including the Growler and Block 3 upgrades, with any variety of upgrades coming in the future. With Ukraine having a fairly limited military budget pre-war, and probably even more so post-war, the more use a single airframe can get, the better. The Growlers aren't only a solid option for jamming and electronic warfare, but also CAD and DAD missions, as well as serving kind of as a pseudo AWACS. The jamming and networking capability put the Growler in kind of a similar situation to the F-35 before it. If you're unable to get close to the enemy without the enemy seeing you, you don't necessarily have to do as much. Hold on, let me rephrase that, because the way I said that makes a little sense. If you can get closer to the enemy without them seeing, if you don't pop up on the radar either because you're stealth or because you're jamming it, you can relay any information you can gather to other aircraft that have either a larger payload of missiles or standoff munitions, and they can be the ones to fire without having to get into range of the SAM radars, of the combat air patrols that might pick them up. But if they can't see you because you're jamming their signals, you're probably fine. Now, we'll talk about it more in a moment, but there have been some complaints for years of the main jamming equipment that the Growler uses. However, it is something the U.S. has been working on and has a new jammer coming out in the next few years. I think it's going through its trials right now. But jamming is a difficult thing to do to begin with. This is something that, while the Russians are typically considered to be better at, are also not great at. Jamming, as you would expect, also jams a lot of your own equipment. So having it not destroy your situational awareness is something that's kind of difficult, but it is something that it's less so by comparison to some of the ground teams or some of the enemies, and may also not work in some instances. Like I said, we'll talk about it more in a moment. But more importantly, sure, jamming is important, but data link is probably the lifeblood of this concept, as one of the pieces of equipment is monitoring pods. So this is pulling in all kinds of signals intelligence that can then be relayed to other aircraft. So while it's not AWACS, it's not an early warning detection radar or anything like that, it is something that the Ukrainians don't currently have something for. And this would definitely up their capabilities in the air, especially going forward. Yes, it's not the F-35, but at least in concept it's similar and would be more budget-friendly to the Ukrainians than, well, F-35. With their limited budget, I can't really foresee them getting too many E-2s or E-3s or F-35s in the near future, so this may be kind of the best other option. The same can be said for large tanker aircraft as well. Where there's definitely likely going to be future NATO interoperability, even if Ukraine's never admitted into the ranks of NATO, having the ability for them to refuel themselves on the air is an important future operational ability they'll need. While the Growler isn't a replacement for AWACS, the tanker equipment is not a replacement for dedicated tanker aircraft, but it's something that gives the Ukrainians an edge they don't currently have. Sales propaganda isn't always to be trusted here, but Boeing's HX presentation for Finland's next-generation fighter competition had some interesting information about upgrading from Legacy Hornet to Super Hornet. They estimated that about 60% of Finland's existing Legacy Hornet infrastructure could be repurposed for Super Hornet, since they're fairly similar airframes that use a fairly good number of the same parts, with the Super Hornet using even fewer parts as well. Boeing also estimated that Legacy Hornet to Super Hornet certification for pilots would only take about 10 flights, which they estimated, based on the Finnish Air Force's flight hour requirements, would take about a month. So in war, that might be a lot quicker or maybe slower, just depending on what phase of the war, or if it's post-war, or how all of that works, but generally around a month or two. Not only is the transition from Legacy Hornet to Super Hornet easier on the industrial base and the pilots, but also the maintenance staff. The Legacy and Super Hornets share about 90% of the same avionics systems, with the Super Hornet using 42% fewer parts, making it at least a little bit easier to maintain as long as you have the parts and the knowledge. So overall, the transition into Super Hornet is something that makes a little bit more sense and rounds out the Ukrainian Air Force to a more well-rounded force, as opposed to having just a bunch of F-16s and hoping for the best. Now, what are the problems with the Super Hornet? Well, just like the Legacy Hornet, the Super Hornet is still slower by comparison in terms of its speed, top speed, and acceleration to that of the Flanker and Fulcrum. Along with the upgrade to the Super Hornet as well comes with some upgraded costs. While this may be less of a factor depending on when Super Hornets are allocated, if it happens towards the end of the war or post-war, most likely the price tag, well, maybe causing some sticker shock to some people, might be kind of covered by some of the rebuilding costs or NATO military aid or even EU military aid. There's a whole host of things that can really change that, and well, if NATO is wanting kind of a frontline force, it's something they're probably willing to help the Ukrainians out with quite a bit. Not only that, but Boeing's probably also pretty stoked to have some kind of aircraft in the air that's not an F-15 or the T-7. Coming in at around roughly $60 million per plane, the Super Hornet gets closer to that of the F-16E or Gripen E price tags. However, any procurement deal will likely have generous terms to the state of, considering the state of Ukraine's economy. Much like the Legacy Hornet, the Super Hornet isn't technically considered by most to be an STOL aircraft. However, it is reported that the Super Hornet can stop even shorter than that of the Legacy Hornet for a couple of different reasons, but largely the extended leading edge helps create a little bit more drag, and the larger wings also have larger flaps. With the Legacy Hornet not really having too much of a problem with this either, it's not a huge deal, but it is something that we should note that technically, well, there's also several different definitions of STOL, it doesn't meet any of them. But 2 kilometers in terms of roadways is not that much, honestly. Well, currently the U.S. Navy is the only force waiting for its Super Hornets with an open order. The Aussies and Kuwaitis both have reasonable sized fleets, so they'll be ordering parts within the future, which is kind of good because it keeps those production lines open. However, neither of those operators are close to Ukraine by any means. This means things are a little bit more complicated, but if in terms of transferring while the war is going. But if we consider a post-war procurement, building out the necessary industrial capability would be a little bit easier with the inflow of capital into Ukraine than it would be to, have this happen while the war is going. However, if you do build some of that industry in, say, Poland or Hungary or the Czech Republic or Romania while the war is going, a lot of that can be transferred or repurposed into Super Hornet capability, and then you rebuild the rest in Ukraine post-war. It's something that can happen, but right off of the bat, parts are not going to be readily available anywhere close just from existing stockpiles, but if you're looking at post-war procurement, that may not be that big of a deal to begin with. So when is the right time to send these airframes? Well, the benefit of the Hornet combo is the ability to send a reasonably sized fleet of Legacy Hornets in a semi-short order, while having the option to upgrade to Super Hornet in the future. While I'm not privy to the condition of those Legacy Hornet airframes, the United States Marine Corps has about 15 A's and B's and 71 C's and D's in storage. The Boneyard also has a variety of Legacy Hornets in varying conditions, but they have about a total of 40 of them, at least the last time Google Earth was updated. Canada has a combined fleet of 103 CF-18 A's and B's, that's their Canadian variant of the Legacy Hornet, along with 18 used A's and B's from the Aussies, since they've transitioned to Super Hornet fully. Spain currently operates 72 A's, B's, and A+, and B+, which are more equivalent to C and D in terms of capability. The Kuwaitis are operating 27 C's with 6 D trainers. While they're still waiting on the U.S. Navy to transfer their Super Hornets, they're looking to phase this legacy system out over the coming years in favor of Super Hornet and, I believe, also more Eurofighters. Several countries and the United States Marine Corps have reportedly been interested in buying those old Kuwaiti airframes, but nothing has happened yet, as the U.S. Navy still has not transferred those Super Hornets that were built for the Kuwaitis to the Kuwaitis yet. I guess they're doing shakedowns and stuff. The Swiss Air Force operates 36 C's and D's, and lastly, the Finnish Off Force operates 62 C's and D's. While all of these are varying in conditioning and level of upgrades, that is far more than enough airframes to replace the losses the Ukrainians have suffered so far and provide them more capability. These Legacy Hornets will provide the Ukrainian Air Force better beyond visual range standoff capability, or beyond visual range air-to-air capability and standoff capabilities they don't currently have. Plus, they can use improvised roadways, so they're not hit by either Iranian suicide drones, Iranian cruise missiles, or Russian cruise missiles. As the war winds down and after it ends, the transition to Super Hornet can begin, and a lot of the experience in pretty much every sector can be transferred from Legacy Hornet to Super Hornet, while still increasing the capability of the Ukrainian Air Force for future conflicts. If the transition were to take place in the next 3 to 5 years, Boeing's production lines for Super Hornet would still be active, probably just finishing off existing U.S. Navy orders, and continue to pump out new jets for Ukraine. Also taking into consideration, while it's not a done deal yet, the Indians are also looking at either the Rafale, which is probably more likely, or the Super Hornet for their new carrier. So both of those are options, but if the Indians decide to order, this will continue that production line even more into the future. So how does that work? How does this whole process of getting these planes ready and sending them to Ukraine go? Well, I don't 100% know. This is a very super simplified outsider's view of the process, and at least how I would understand it to work. First and foremost, an assessment would need to be made of all the existing airframes that could be used. Most likely these would come from U.S. mothball fleet, the U.S. Marine Corps storage units, Canada, Kuwait, and Spain. While I doubt all of the stored and mothballed airframes could be operable again, even 10% of those airframes would serve to replace the severely decimated or destroyed Su-24 tactical aviation brigades. That's a pretty big deal, especially with standoff munitions. Along with the U.S. options, adapting the 18 used Aussie planes in the Canadian service would be a big boost without severely restricting the Canadians' air defense. If transitioning of the Kuwaiti Super Hornets can start sooner rather than later, they might be willing to sell back their fleet of 33 Cs and Ds. This would go a long way as well, especially with those 6D trainers. Lastly, we have Spain and their 72 As and Bs, A pluses and B pluses. Spain's currently in the process of transitioning away from Legacy Hornet in favor of more Eurofighter Typhoons, which they already have a fairly sizable fleet of, which frees up this fairly large fleet of Legacy Hornets. This again may require a buyback on the US's part, with some upgrades to come, but the airframes could be purchased, and the existing Plus models are already pretty close to C and D in terms of capabilities. I don't include the Finns here, as they're probably going to want to wait for F-35 before they start making any moves of their existing modernized Legacy Hornets. While the Hornets weren't as prolific as the Viper, they're no slouch in terms of numbers. As great as having hundreds of mothballed or stored Vipers is, Ukraine doesn't exactly need like 400 or 500 airframes. Honestly, 100 is probably more than plenty. And if, several hundred were put into service, there's no way they could keep those running in the future. This is something that they had post-Soviet era with the collapse of the Soviet Union, where they have these massive stockpiles of aircraft and tanks that they just had to decommission because they couldn't maintain them, so they've just kind of been rotting for 30 years. Now, that does leave them available for parts, but at the same time, you're probably not getting most of those airframes back into service, unfortunately. Along with the airframes, parts, and general maintenance guidelines will need to be evaluated as well to ensure that the planes start service in the Ukrainian Air Force and can keep running. Assessing the industrial need of keeping the Hornets in the sky, as well as future transition to Super Hornet, is also pretty important. With Boeing estimating that Finland could reuse about 60% of their existing Legacy Hornet industrial base with the transition to Super Hornet, building everything or most everything from scratch with Super Hornet in mind will likely push that number quite a bit higher. Starting the reconstitution process of the airframes should include Ukrainian maintenance staff, ideally, so that they can understand how the plane systems interconnect and have a better understanding once they get into service versus just going through some classroom learning and then maybe some hands-on training for a month or two before heading back to Ukraine. The start of Phase 2 focuses on building out all of the ground maintenance capabilities, or at least the first two phases of ground maintenance capabilities of the Ukrainian Air Force. While the other countries, probably Finland and maybe Spain, could offer help with repairs, keeping any damaged airframes close to, if not in Ukraine, might be best. Not only preparing these facilities, but also preparing the staff working in them is pretty important. Just for some reference, the United States Marine Corps, I believe, also the Navy and possibly the Air Force, all kind of operate on a similar basis of having 3 levels of maintenance. Kind of your regular, basic, everyday maintenance you're doing, your repairs you can do there, and then having to send them back to Boeing for more severe repairs. Building out the daily maintenance and on-site repair capability is incredibly important to keep these running, while, using infrastructure in other countries to help repair those more severely damaged units if needed. Training with United States Navy and United States Marine Corps maintenance personnel in Poland or Germany could also help Ukrainian mechanics get up to speed before the airframes arrive. Now, this isn't any replacement for experience or classroom instruction, because both of those will still have to happen. However, every little edge the Ukrainians can get will likely pay off in pretty big ways time-wise. Along with this training, having select Ukrainian personnel help with that reconstitution of those airframes should help provide a better wealth of knowledge and help them hit the ground running when things do kick off. Not only do the maintainers and mechanics need training, but also the pilots. Luckily, the United States Navy has run exercises with several countries that still fly a variety of Soviet-era aircraft like Mig-29 and Su-27. So this is not something that they couldn't have access to in terms of information, or that tactical guides could be drawn up. Now, this is also something that's not purely unique to the Hornets. Technically, the F-16 has that same experience, but generally speaking, having that knowledge is always a good thing, and all things equal, this, I think, still puts the Hornet out in front of the Viper. Now, training is done, airframes are complete, it's time to start moving things around. First, we need to get munitions and parts into secure locations either within Ukraine's border or at least bordering states so that they could be trucked or bussed over when necessary. This is to largely get the areas these planes will be operating in ready for when those planes arrive. Speaking of the aircraft, there are two options as well to get them into Ukraine proper. You could get them back to operable state in chunks and then have them transported over to, say, Poland, and then have them trucked across the border to be reassembled in Ukraine. Or, probably the less ideal of the two, you could have them rebuilt and fly over to Europe somehow, either with refueling or have them loaded onto a carrier to be taken over across the Atlantic and then transitioned through Europe so that they can fly into Ukraine. However, regardless of where you're going to be flying into Ukraine, the capability of the Russians to reach you was still going to be intact. So you may need to fly armed, and if any conflict happens over NATO airspace, it could be a huge mess. So I'd imagine this is not something that would be of interest to NATO nations. Lastly, we have the transition to Super Hornet. Training periods for pilots, crews, maintenance, and civilian contractors should be a fairly quick process, leaving the training for the Growler and Tanker teams to be the most intensive of the bunch. While not all industry built out for supporting Legacy Hornets will likely transfer over, some things just may not be able to be reconstituted or may just have to be shut down because, well, they don't need those parts anymore. A majority of it should be able to do so if Boeing is to be believed. We'll take a look at which Tactical Aviation Brigade I think should transition to Growler/Tanker/support role a little bit more in a moment, but having one Tactical Aviation Brigade dedicated to these roles would greatly enhance the Ukrainian Air Force's overall capabilities. So, let's start off with the 7th and 204th Tactical Aviation Brigades based out of the Western Air Command. They were using Su-24s in a bomber/strike/recon type role. While recon is a little bit less important at the moment with drones and NATO assistance with intelligence gathering, the Legacy Hornets do have the option for the Advanced Tactical Aviation Reconnaissance System, ATARS. However, this is something that replaces effectively the nose cone of the Legacy Hornet, and I don't know how many of those are still kicking around. So, well, it's not a huge problem, like I said, because they're using drones for more localized intelligence gathering, and NATO has a lot of capabilities they're sharing as well. It is something to note. Now, more importantly, in the bomber/striker role, we have the Legacy and Super Hornets having the availability to use things like Slammer ER, JSOW, or JSAM. Slammer ER having a standoff range of about 195 miles. You have the JSOW at high altitude release getting about 70 miles. And then there are several different variants of the JSAM, but largely speaking, It has the capability of going anywhere from 142 miles up to 1180. So it has a wild range. It has initial guidance systems or inertial guidance systems as well as GPS. So this isn't something you have to necessarily lead in. These are more for solid, stable, not moving targets. This is not a tactical weapon. It's a strategic weapon. So air bases, railways, railway hubs, munitions depots, any kind of static thing, this is something they can strike. They can use to strike with. These would be kind of the next step from the ATCAMs that the Ukrainians have been asking for, and honestly would give them much deeper striking capability if they were trying to strike targets in Crimea. There's a host of weapons that can be used for both Legacy and Super Hornets, so they could start using them pretty rapidly and then continue to use them into the future. As a side note, this is also probably the first tactical aviation brigade that would need to get these, as not only does the Hornet series give them more capability, in particular for these roles, the Su-27 or Su-24 fleet has been pretty much decimated. There's still some videos of a few flying around, but it doesn't look like there's very many of them. Next, we have the 299th out of the Southern Air Command flying Su-25s for CAS, close air support, and ground attack missions. The Hornets can use a variety of air-to-ground munitions like the AGM-65 Maverick, a whole host of bombs, both guided and unguided, and rocket pods. You've got things like the Maverick, which has a range of about 13 miles. This is something that not only has the Hornet used, but also the F-16 pretty prominently has used as well. You have the Paveway laser-guided bombs. You have the JDAM guidance kit for older dumb bombs, plus all the other dumb bombs you can carry. You have the Hydra 70 and Zuni rocket pods as well, and rocket pods are something the Ukrainians are very used to using, much more so than any of the NATO countries. So you have a lot of capability here. You have the GBU series, the Paveway series effectively, going anywhere from 28 to 69 miles, depending on which variant and what type of target. Moving targets, it gets closer to the 28 to 45 range, once again, depending on which version. And then JDAM, generally speaking, has a range of about 17 miles with any munitions it's applied to. Now, I do have the Mig-29 Tactical Aviation Brigade separated, and we'll talk about more why in a moment. But we have the air-to-air, kind of the first wave of air-to-air, the front line, if you will, with the 40th and 204th, with the 40th being based in the Central Air Command and the 204th operating out of the Southern Air Command. Yes, it's the same 204th, but they had to split for some reason after the seizure of Crimea, because that's where they were originally based. These tactical aviation brigades are operating MiG-29, so switching to the Hornet would likely be a welcome change given the capability for longer range munitions. They'd also be able to operate the shorter range AIM-9X, the ASRAAM, the IRIS-T series of missiles, along with the BVR capable AIM-120C AMRAAMs in both the C and D variants. The AMRAAM will push the Ukrainians' reach out to about 60 to 90 miles, much further than that of their current operating with the base model of the R-27 Alamo. I haven't been able to find very clear answers on this, but I have seen some evidence that the Ukrainians operate the R-27ER, which gets around about the 80-mile mark, but a more modern interconnected aircraft system with more modern data link like the Hornets will likely be able to get more out of the AMRAAM Cs and Ds than the current Ukrainians are able to get out of the R-27ER series of missiles. The Hornets can also use the AGM-84 Harpoon series of missiles for anti-ship operations, which is, if I'm correct, kind of the base that the Neptune missile was built on, so they would have some similarities in how these things would work. And they could also continue to use the AGM-88E HARM for SEAD and DEAD missions. Now we have the 114th. They're operating out of the Western Air Command, and this is the Tactical Aviation Brigade I think could work best in the new support role once Super Hornets come around. Sure, they can still use the same host of air-to-air missiles we just talked about. However, the standout equipment here is the tanker and Growler loadouts. Having the tanker role without the expensive, vulnerable, dedicated tanker aircraft should give the Ukrainians a little bit more loiter time to extend combat air patrol missions when needed. This would also help give them more range into the Black Sea if they need to start attacking Black Sea's fleet ships or to strike targets in Crimea. Well, striking Black Sea's fleet isn't necessarily the biggest thing in the world. If there comes the day that they start harassing grain shipments again, this may be much more necessary. Then we have the Growler, the dedicated electronic warfare aircraft. While the current AN/ALQ-99 jamming pods are older and have been problematic in the past, with them either not working or jamming other pretty important equipment, it should be said that they still, in most cases, disrupt enemy search capabilities and communications, but the U.S. is currently looking to upgrade them. They're currently in the trials for the AN/ALQ-249. By the time the Super Hornet rolls around to Ukrainian service, bringing the Growler with it, this would most likely at least be out of testing and into early production phases if everything goes well. Last but most definitely not least, and probably the most important aspect of the Growler, is the AN/ALQ-218 little pods that go on the ends of the wingtips, as well as replacing the gun in the Super Hornet, that are used for data monitoring and information gathering. This would, along with some of the more advanced data link capabilities, serve as a small pseudo stand-in for the much larger, much more expensive AWACS aircraft. It's not one-to-one, I fully understand. Don't harass me about it, I get it. But this is a capability that the Ukrainians don't currently have, and while this may not be something that really helps them within the war if it happens post-war, this would be a much bigger deterrent for any future Russian aggression, as they would have much more interconnected flight capability and could do a lot more with fewer jets than the Russians could do with a lot, if the Russians could even keep them fueled and running. Lastly, we have the 39th and 831st Tactical Aviation Brigades and the Central Air Command rocking Su-27s. These are mostly your pure air-to-air fighters, focusing more on combat air patrol or air superiority missions, but it does look like they've been equipped with HARMs in some instances, so they may be doing SEAD and DEAD roles, along with some of the Mig-29s, as well as interdiction of ballistic missiles, or cruise missiles, rather. So keep in mind, there's that, but one thing that the Ukrainians will likely appreciate is both the Su-27 and the Hornets, Legacy and Super, are missile trucks. Much like the F-15, they can carry a lot of munitions if needed. This is commonly, from my understanding, referred to as the Murder Hornet configuration. You have your two AIM-9s on the outside, and everything else is AMRAAM of some variety, so you are ready for most any air-to-air combat. Now, granted, this is a very specific situation you want to use something like this in, but it is capable of doing it and can carry more munitions than that of the F-16. Now for the politics and logistics of the Legacy Hornet. First and foremost, if this option is being discussed with the DoD or the Ukrainian's Ministry of Defense, you can be sure Boeing isn't far away. Their ears are burning. While Lockheed Martin hasn't been hurting for F-35 business, Boeing has been doing a little bit worse, with only 3 countries currently operating Super Hornets. Yes, they are still doing F-15 stuff, but still, they are not rocking too hot there with just 3 countries rocking Super Hornets. You can be sure Boeing would be in and very excited about any kind of discussion happening around Super Hornet. And that's a good thing. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a huge fan of big corporate collusion and whatnot, but Boeing is going to be an instrumental part in repairing Legacy Hornets for Ukraine, and will probably be one of the biggest in doing so. Yes, the United States Navy, Marine Corps, if they were to help do that, could do it, but they are already stretched pretty thin. Boeing, not much better, but would have more of the capability of doing so with its civilian contractors if the United States Marine Corps and Navy are willing to wait on some things. Now, not only would they be instrumental in getting those Legacy Hornets up and running, they would be instrumental in making sure that the maintenance capabilities and parts manufacturing would be built out in Europe. Whether it's extending supply lines from Finland or Spain or Switzerland, or just building new ones in Poland or Hungary, Romania, or the Czech Republic, they would be purely necessary. So having them in on any of this is pretty important. Now, outside of the U.S. government, in terms of its politics with, trying to negotiate with Boeing and the leadership of the Navy and Marine Corps, you would also have to consider the governments of Canada, Spain, and Kuwait. They might need some convincing as well. The Spanish Air Force, having 68 Eurofighters already with more on order, wouldn't be losing a ton of combat capability moving Legacy Hornets, and if they did so on a fairly slow basis, that would impact their overall capability a little less, and while it's never good to lose aircraft that you need to keep pilot hours up, it's something that Spain isn't necessarily exactly in danger of being invaded by Russia. Now, they may not be on good terms with them, and they've been supplying weapons to Ukraine, but it's not like the Russians could really go all the way across Europe at the moment. It is still very likely, though, that the U.S. would need to purchase these to have them updated or upgraded by Boeing to send to Ukraine. Canada's main combat aircraft, however, is their CF-18s. And while they're not necessarily a high-threat region, they do cover a lot of the Arctic Circle airspace that the Russians can typically be considered to be a threat in, so they wouldn't want to get a lot of their air power away. However, those used Aussie airframes might be okay, especially if the U.S. ups their mission parameters, I guess, their ability to do missions in that region a little bit to kind of help cover. Kuwait's Air Force also does have 6 Eurofighters on order, plus the bulk of they have 6 Eurofighters currently with more on order. So most of their air power currently is Legacy Hornets, but luckily for them, Boeing has finished the production run of the Super Hornets that they have ordered. They've transferred them to the U.S. Navy. They're just waiting for the U.S. Navy to transfer them to Kuwait, which is estimated to happen in 2023. So the sooner that happens, the sooner those Legacy Hornets can start being transitioned out of service. And with the famed Swiss neutrality, I doubt there would be a big transfer of F-18s, especially since that's their more modern aircraft by comparison to the S-5. But the U.S. has bought F-5s from Sweden or Switzerland in the past, so maybe they would be down to sell some of those Legacy Hornets. Just with the Legacy Hornets, if Super Hornets are on the table, you can bet Boeing is in on that conversation. Generally speaking, new production of Super Hornets would make the most sense, as the production of the U.S. Navy's Super Hornets will either be concluding by the time the war finishes in anywhere from 3 to 5 to 6 years. Probably. That's just a very wild guess, but generally speaking, these production lines stay active for a while because it takes a while to build an airplane. Generally speaking, probably still active, and if the hopes of Super Hornets for Ukraine exist, they will keep them active somehow. Now, this is probably going to be the best thing in terms of Super Hornets for Ukraine, because I doubt any existing active units would be pulled, as the U.S. Navy operates quite a few of them, but it is their primary carrier fighter at the moment. And then the Kuwaitis and Aussies fielding less than 30 each. It's not like there's a lot of these kicking around, so new production runs make the most sense. Negotiating that with the government of Ukraine with fairly reasonable, probably fairly beneficial economic terms for Ukraine would most likely be the best interest of both parties. Now, it should be once again noted that India is still considering Super Hornet and Rafale for their new carrier. I'm not holding my breath as Super Hornet gets to that contract, honestly. The Indians have a history of dealing with French arms as more so than American arms, so I don't know that the Super Hornet has the capability there, but It would necessitate new manufacturing capabilities within India, and anytime an economic activity is a part of one of these procurement packages, it can change the whole deal, even if a country already operates Rafales, kind of like India does for the Air Force. It's still up in the air. No direct announcements have been made, and I may make a short video covering it because I find it quite interesting. But it is something that can continue those production lines, keeping them open if needed longer, and if that worked out. It is also possible that the Ukrainians could get a similar airframe to that the Kuwaitis got, where it's technically a Block 2, but it's got a lot of Block 3 features without the conformal fuel tanks and some of the other internal components. But generally it is up to Block 3 specs. So that might help kind of shave the price down a little bit if needed. But generally speaking, this is something that is going to be good for Boeing's bottom line, as well as some of the economic growth in Ukraine. So those are my thoughts. Let me know in the comments down below if you think I'm an idiot for even bringing this up, or if you think, hey, maybe this guy has a little bit of a point. It's wild that I do. I don't know. Maybe I do. I don't know. But the special thanks, I have a lot here. There is a YouTube video on Civet Wings YouTube channel that is the full Boeing HX fighter program presentation for Block 3 Super Hornet and Advanced Growler. Very interesting video. Definitely well worth watching. There's a report by Reuters from Ann Karenin, talking about Finland starting their highway fighter drills for the first time in decades due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The confessions of a U.S. Marine FA-18 Hornet maintainer over on the drive by Tyler Rogaway. Very, very interesting article. There are several articles I looked at from the Aviation Geek Club. Really interesting stuff over there as well. One talking about the difference between the Legacy Hornet and the Intruder, the A6, and then another one taking a look at the United States Marine Corps being interested in purchasing some of those Legacy Hornets from Kuwait. Some of the more base information as well was pulled from manfast.org, the DoD Comptroller's Office for some financial information, the U.S. Navy's Information Office, Ward Carroll's YouTube channel, Military Aviation's YouTube channel, Justin Bronk, and then several wikis, largely Wikipedia and plain encyclopedia. So what am I working on next? Well, outside of possibly doing that Indian naval fighter competition video, which would be very short, and maybe another tier list in the future if you're interested. Ukraine's next main battle tank is probably the next one up, maybe taking a break from aircraft. Then probably the case against the F-16, Ukraine's future Air Force composition, including more than one jet, and then the future of Ukraine's Navy, as I know the least about naval ships, but also find them vastly interesting. So I'm nearly done with the presentation for the main battle tank, but I haven't got the script fully together. And I've started pretty much the rest of these with just a few assets. So the next one for sure is going to be Ukraine's next battle tank. So let me know in the comments down below if you have thoughts on that, or if there's anything else you would like me to talk about. Anyway, I've been Cody. Thanks for listening to me ramble. I appreciate it. I'll see you in the next one.